again, here's our survey. It's covering 10 chapters of material. We won't get into it that in depth, but we're going to do this overview, which makes it a survey. There's a study guide, so you don't have to sift through the chapters to find the information that you need. Should all be there for you. All right, so how many body systems have we got here? 11. We're going to talk about all of these a little bit, except integument. We don't really cover integument too much. Do you guys know what integument is? Skin, yeah. Yeah, skin and associated structures, right? That's your integumentary system. For some reason, the book doesn't really go into that one too much, but we'll talk about it a little bit. The rest of them we'll visit sort of one by one. Just to remind you what we're talking about when we're talking about body systems, way back from the beginning of biology 1, we probably talked about levels of biological organization. And the smallest particles you start with are atoms, and then atoms interact with one another to form molecules and compounds. Right, the next level would be organelles. If you're talking about eukaryotes, you have specialized function, and then organelles are all contained within cells. Right, cell theory tells us that cells are the smallest unit that is capable of all the functions that define a living organism, right, like reproduction and energy processing and things like that. We talked at length in the last chapter about tissues. So tissues are cells that are collaborating together, right? Same shape, same embryonic origin, organized to function together. So cells make up tissues. If you take multiple types of tissue and layer them together, you end up with organs, okay? So if you think about something like your heart, right? You've got muscle tissue, you've got connective tissue, you've got epithelial tissue, and you've got nervous tissue all together, right? That makes up an organ. And then when you put multiple organs together, you get to organ system. Okay, so an organ system is just a collection of organs and associated structures that function as a unit to carry out a particular role or set of roles to keep you alive, which is basically homeostasis, right? The jobs are to keep you in homeostasis. So organ systems constantly adjust to stimuli, and stimuli can be external. Like, what's an example of an external stimulus that you have to adjust to? Sure, to temperature, right? Ambient temperature. Anything else you can think of? That's probably the number one thing that comes to mind, right? Especially for us, since we are pretty comfortable creatures. What about internal stimuli that your body systems have to work to adjust? There's some examples up here, so you can peek if you want. pH. Yeah, what is pH?
It's the concentration of hydroxide.
Yes, that's the technical definition. You are correct. Concentration of hydroxide and hydrogen ions. A little bit simpler would be acid or base, right? How acidic or how alkaline is your system? Internal body temperature, right? That's another one. Blood glucose levels. What's glucose? Yeah, blood sugar, right? Blood calcium levels. Calcium, you guys, is important for like 100 different things. Without calcium, you can't do anything. You can't stay in homeostasis. Osmotic balance. What does that mean? I have a little clue up here. Well, there are 2 clues here, and then here's a clue. Salt and water, essentially, right? In its simplest form. So really, this should say solute, but salt is a type of solute. You guys remember solutes and solutions? Solutes are the dissolved stuff, right? Salt, sugar, dissolved proteins, whatever is dissolved in a solvent, which makes up a solution. So osmotic balance is how much water versus solvent ratio you have in your bloodstream. All of these things and more, right? Your body systems have to work together to keep you in homeostasis. So that's the point of all the systems. So let's just go ahead and jump in, see how far we get through these body systems. So the first system your book covers, the first chapter, 34, is on nutrition and the digestive system. So I like talking about the digestive system. It's an interesting one. They're all pretty interesting, really. The first thing I want to do here is just talk about what animals eat and how we classify them by their diet. We talk about nutrition. So we've got herbivores, carnivores, and omnivores. You guys know what those terms mean, right? What's a herbivore? Yeah, it eats plants. Digestive systems are adapted to a plant-based diet. It's not just that they think they're delicious, but they're actually well adapted to eat them. So they have like longer intestines. Sometimes they have extra stomachs, like in the case of ruminants. because plant fiber is harder to break down than other types of tissues that you might eat. So they're specially adapted to those types of diets. What about carnivores? Meat, yep. Lions, primary example, right? Did you guys know ladybugs are also vicious carnivores? Know that? You know what they eat? They eat aphids. You know what aphids are? Even smaller insects that eat plants. So if you are a gardener, ladybugs are your friend because they're going around eating up all the aphids. And then what's an omnivore? Yeah, plants, animals, pretty much whatever. Bears are omnivores. Crayfish are omnivores. They'll just eat pretty much anything, kind of opportunistic feeders. So back over to our herbivores, I'm going to give you guys some terms that you probably I don't know, maybe you've heard before, maybe these are new for you, but these are further subdivisions of an herbivorous diet. So you get frugivores. We're going to guess what these mean. And unless you know already, then you can just tell me. Folivores, nectivores, and granivores. Any takers want to guess what these guys eat? Anybody know what frugivores mean? Fruit. Yep. Fruit eaters. What about folivores? Leaves. Yeah. Why? Foliage. Right. What about nectivores? Nectar. Yeah. Like who? Bees. Butterflies. Hummingbirds. Right. Good. What about granivores? Grains. Seeds. Yeah. So those are just some subdivisions of herbivorous diets, and you get that specialization, or you can get herbivores that will eat any of this stuff, right? So it just depends on what you're adapted to and what's available in your environment. This is review of how your digestive system develops. Which animal phyla retain the simple body plan with only one opening? Do you guys remember? Well, who's this? What phylum does that represent? Do you guys remember that? Or do you know what these are drawings of? Hydra. Yep, jellies and hydras. You're almost there, aren't you? Does it begin with an A? Does not begin with an A. I'll give you a hint. It begins with a C, but it's a silent C.
Oh, Nigeria.
Nigeria, yeah. So these guys are radially symmetric. They have two germ layers, right? They're still diploblasts, and they're Nigerian. So their gastrovascular cavity is all they have, right? Their mouth and their anus is the same. Yes, just one hole in and out. Okay. So this is that simpler body plan. When you get into more complex animals, into triploblasts, you have a whole tube, right? And that's what we talked about with that embryonic development, where you have the blastula that invaginates, and sometimes the tube stops. If the tube stops before it goes all the way through, you have a gastrovascular cavity. If it keeps going, you have a mouth and an anus. And then this is a new term for us, alimentary canal. That becomes your alimentary canal. The term alimentary canal actually is the tube from one opening to the other. So if you think about your digestive tract, although it is internal to you, it's actually external to the environment, right? Because your sandwich doesn't ever travel around in your actual body. It's all contained in that canal that travels all the way through and gets processed until what you don't need comes out the other end, right? So it's actually an external tube. Kind of a weird thing to think about. But that's what an alimentary canal is. Now there are going to be accessory organs that aren't in that tube, but they're connected to that tube. They're dumping stuff in, like digestive enzymes. So we're going to look at those a little bit on the next slide here. But before we do that, animals with an alimentary canal are classified by which of the two openings forms first. Remember that? How are they classified if the mouth forms first? What's the term for that? You guys remember that one? What about if the anus forms first and the mouth is second? Remember that one? Deuterostome. Yeah, second mouth. So what is first mouth? Protostome. How about that? Like prototype, right? The first one to make protostome. So protostomes, mouth first, deuterostomes, mouth second. Okay, so that's just review. These are both just review questions. Doesn't hurt, right? To pull you back a little ways. Okay, one opening or two, exciting stuff. All right, let's look at the actual digestive system. So in this case, we're talking more about humans. Okay, on the next slide, we'll look a little bit more at specialization in other animals. But let's talk about how we work first, because humans are animals. Yes? Animals are heterotrophs, which makes you a heterotroph. What is a heterotroph? Remind me. Yeah, you have to eat stuff to get your energy. You consume other organisms to get energy. You can't photosynthesize or chemosynthesize. You can't make your own energy. So here are just some bullet points to get us to what your digestive system is doing actually. Food consists of proteins, fats, and complex carbohydrates. If you've ever talked to anybody who's interested in dietetics or nutrition at all, you know those are your macros, right? So how many proteins are you eating? How much fat are you eating? How many carbs are you eating, and so on, right? But these are macromolecules, right? So they're made up of constituent parts. Proteins are built from amino acids. That rings a bell, right? Everybody loves biochemistry. Fats are built up of smaller lipid molecules, fatty acids, and things of that nature. Carbohydrates are built from chains of simple sugars that get more complex as the molecules get bigger and the compounds get larger. And nucleotides. What are nucleotides, you guys? Building blocks of what? You know this, it's just not on the tip of your mind right now. What do you, when you string nucleotides together, you get molecules of nucleic acids, right? And what are nucleic acids? Yes, DNA and RNA, right? So when you eat food, you are also consuming nucleotides because you're eating other organisms, right? And that's where the nucleotides come from that you actually use to build your DNA and RNA. Because you're making RNA constantly, you're making DNA constantly, right? And those nucleotides have to come from somewhere. So when you break down your food in your digestive system, you break it down into these smaller constituent parts that then you use to build other things. So you use amino acids to build new proteins. So you eat it, you break it down, you absorb those amino acids, you store them in your tissues or in your free what's the word I'm looking for? I'm trying not to say nucleotide again. Nutrients, free nutrient pool. So you've got amino acids, you've got fatty acids, you've got sugars, you've got nucleotides floating around ready for you to start building other things. But that's how it gets there, right? You have to eat it. Conversion of foods to nutrients requires digestion and absorption, and they are two different things. Okay, and your digestive system does both. So digestion refers to breaking food particles down into smaller components, sandwiched to constituent parts, right? And then absorption is moving those substances across your tissues of your digestive tract. Because remember, it's isolated from your internal tissues. It's a tube that runs from outside to outside, right? And stuff travels through it. So absorption is the process by which you take those amino acids or those sugars and you move them out of your intestines and into your bloodstream. Okay, so those are two separate processes. If we look a little bit more closely at digestion itself, you've got both mechanical and chemical methods of digestion or breaking down your food. So mechanical digestion is just mechanically manipulating that substance. So you got chewing, that counts. Your stomach muscles move food around back and forth. Your stomach is actually pretty cool. It's made up of 3 layers of muscle, and the fibers of those muscles run in 3 different directions. So that if some of them contract and then the others contract, they can do like this, right? So your food goes like around, like mixing the contents of your stomach. What kind of muscle do you think that is? Skeletal muscle, smooth muscle, or cardiac muscle? Smooth, why? Are you concentrating to make your stomach move? Involuntary, yeah, for sure. So remember, it's a tube, so it's probably lined with smooth muscle, definitely. So you swallow. Let me not get ahead of myself because I want to introduce this term. It's one of my favorite ones, and that is a bolus. So digestion begins in the mouth where you start chewing. The scientific term for chewing is mastication, if you've ever heard that. Chewing and mixing of saliva, which is the first step in chemical digestion. So chemical digestion is where you have enzymes that start to break things down as well. So you've got mechanical stimulation or manipulation of food. You also have chemicals that are starting to break things down into smaller pieces. And you have some of those enzymes in your saliva. So you start digesting things like carbohydrates, especially simple carbs, before you ever even swallow. But when you chew your food and you mix it with saliva, you produce what's called a bolus. So a bolus is the scientific term for your chewed up food. Because you got to know if there's a scientific term for chewed up food, you should know what it is, right? You can sound very educated and talk about not, showing people your chewed up food. Anyway, once you swallow, the bolus is moved through the alimentary canal, which is your digestive tube, by the action of smooth muscle contraction. So this is where I wanted to go back over here. So you chew and you make a bolus, okay? As soon as that bolus passes right about here, which is pharynx, right, your throat, it gets into your esophagus and you have lost control of what happens, right? Mostly. So your esophagus is lined with smooth muscle. It's going to contract in waves that are called peristalsis, right? You don't need to know that term because I don't think it's on here, but basically it's doing this: contract, relax, down the tube to push your bolus down your esophagus to your stomach, okay? Then you have sphincters, which are circular muscles that control the entrance and exit of all these tubes, all these parts of the tube. So you've got a sphincter here that the bolus plops down into your stomach, and that sphincter closes to make sure that stuff doesn't pop back out again. Have you guys ever heard of GERD, or gastroesophageal reflux disease, or just reflux? People say they have reflux, they take like antacids and stuff. That sometimes can be because your sphincter here is a little bit too relaxed and stuff can bounce back out. What's going on in here pH-wise in your stomach? Super acidic, right? Like 2, 1 pH, really, really acidic in your stomach. So different things are going on at different places in the tube. You've got enzymes and acid going on in your stomach, and you've got smooth muscle, right, doing that churning. And then you've got another sphincter here that controls release into your small intestines, where peristalsis takes over again. Smooth muscle contractions, pushing stuff through. But not only, this is also cool, I think, in your small intestine, not only do you have muscles that are contracting peristaltically to get that food to move forward through the tract, but you also have muscles that are doing this. So that as it's moving through, it's kind of going forward a little bit, backward a little bit, forward a little bit, backward a little bit. Which makes sense if you think about what's going on in the small intestine. Absorption of nutrients occurs there. Okay, so there's 6 meters plus of length of small intestine, highly folded surface to increase surface area for absorption. So this is where your nutrients are going across your tissues into your bloodstream, being carried away to be processed in different places. But what do you think the muscle movement that makes food go back and forth as it's moving through? What is the point, do you think? Why would it do that instead of just going straight through? It goes a little bit forward and a little bit back, a little bit forward and a little bit back. It's time, right? It's spending more time in that tissue that's allowing for absorption. The other cool thing, I'm going to draw a picture for you here. It's not on the slide. All right. I could have erased this to start with. I'm going to draw you a rough sketch of what it looks like inside your intestines. You can see. As far as surface area. So remember how we talked about diffusion and surface to volume ratio? If you don't have enough surface area, you can't move stuff across the surface as efficiently, right? So your intestines are like this super long tube, 6 meters or so of small intestines. Again, this is rough, as I promised. All right, so that's a lot of length all wadded up in your abdomen all by itself. It's not, though, a smooth tube like a hose on the inside. It is folded, highly infolded. So inside of your intestines, and I'm only going to draw it on the one part because it would take all day. You have these folds inside in the wall of your small intestine. They're called villi, and they're there to increase the surface area. So there's more room for absorption. These are tiny arrows that you can't see from back there or on Zoom. But nutrients are moving out into your bloodstream. Okay, so you've got all these little folds. So you've got 6 meters of length, then you've got all this infolding, which increases that surface area. On top of that, you've got, on top of each one of these villi, you have more folds, you guys. So it looks like this. Those are called microvilli. So if you take the length of your small intestine and you add the surface area of the villi, and then you add the surface area of the microvilli, you have got tons of area for nutrients to absorb across. Form and function, right? You guys with me? Did you know you were so highly infolded in your intestines? Interesting stuff. I like bars. Okay, what else shall we talk about here? Okay, accessory organs, as promised. You've got a liver, you have a gallbladder, you have a pancreas. These are all considered part of your digestive system, even though they're not part of the alimentary canal itself. So the alimentary canal is oral cavity, esophagus, stomach, small intestine, large intestine, anus, right? The tube. So these guys aren't part of the tube, but they have ducts that dump stuff into the tube. Okay, so your liver is making, among other things, it's making bile, and bile helps you break down fats. So your gallbladder is where it is stored, and that is the tube, the bile duct that dumps into your small intestine. Okay, so that's why they're called accessory organs, because they're adding secretions that aid in digestion, but they're not part of the tube. Pancreas also. Pancreas, do you guys know what's made your pancreas? Insulin. Yep, insulin and glucagon, so the hormones that control blood sugar, but also digestive enzymes. Pancreatic amylase for carbohydrates, for example. It also makes sodium bicarbonate, which is alkaline. Right? Bicarb ions get dumped into your small intestine. So why would it be beneficial? I want you to think about this for a second. To have a tube connected to your pancreas right at the entrance to your small intestine that is dumping alkaline substances into the system. What do you think?
So getting balance out the acid from the stomach.
Balancing out the acid from the stomach. So when this substance, your bolus has gone into your stomach, it has become a highly acidic substance called chyme. But the chyme is like a 2, a pH of 2. That's super strong acid, but your small intestine is not built to handle that. Okay, it's built for absorption. It's actually pretty delicate on the inside. Your stomach's tough. Your stomach can handle it. Your small intestine cannot. So your pancreas starts secreting bicarbonate into your system to neutralize that acid. So by the time that chyme enters your small intestine, it's like more of a neutral pH. Form and function, pretty cool. Okay, so you move your stuff, all of your chyme, you're digesting from food through your small intestine. All that nutrient absorption happens over that incredibly highly folded surface area that I drew over here for you. Water and minerals are the only thing that's really left in the food, the digesting food, and that gets absorbed mostly in the large intestine. And then whatever is left is defecated. Okay, that's the scientific term for pooping. Yeah.
Why does some people get it all better? Isn't it like not?
It's not necessarily necessary. Yeah. So if you have cholecystitis, like inflammation of your gallbladder, it's really painful, and oftentimes it's easier to take it out than it is to try to continue to treat things like gallstones. So you get like crystals that form in your gallbladder, and it really hurts. So yeah, you can take it out and you can live without one. Mostly you just have to modify your diet a little bit for fats. So you may have trouble with like really fatty stool if you eat a high fat diet without enough bile being deposited. But you can still get some bile just straight from your liver. So they make it so the bile duct goes straight from liver to intestine instead of into the gallbladder for storage. But because you can't store it, you can't like wait and sort of dump it in as needed. If you eat a fatty meal, your body would dump in bile from your gallbladder. But if you don't have that storage, then it's just sort of like a slow trickle all the time. So you can still eat fat, you just can't eat like a whole lot of it at once. Does that make sense? Yeah. So it's kind of like your gallbladder does important things, but it's not life altering. It's not life threatening if you don't have it. It's kind of like just some things you can do without. Good. All right. Let's look at specialized digestive tracts really quickly. This is what I was getting at when we were talking about herbivores versus carnivores and so on. Humans and herbivores have a monogastric digestive system that is one stomach and intestines, right? So here's us again. This looks familiar. Look at the rabbit though. What is different between humans and rabbits? that you can visualize easily. What do you notice about intestines? Yeah, longer, more surface area, right? Well, what do rabbits eat? Plants only, right? Strictly herbivores. So they have to have more surface area for digestion. Their food spends more time in their digestive tract because plant fiber is hard to digest. So they're actually well adapted to do that. They also will eat their droppings a second time, not because they're gross, but because there's still nutrients in there that they can digest out if they go through it a second time. So you will see animals do that, and they're not just being weird, right? They're actually in some way adapted to do that. It's called coprophagy. There's a name for everything, right? And then avian digestive system is digastric. What do you think digastric means? If monogastric means you have one stomach, what does digastric mean? Two stomachs. You've got a proventriculus and you've got a gizzard. You also have a crop, which is for storage. So birds do it a little differently. They've got this area where they can eat a whole bunch of stuff and then digest it a little bit at a time through their two stomachs. And then ruminants, like I mentioned before, ruminants are things like cows and goats, have four stomachs. So they can spend a whole lot of time digesting stuff. Have you guys ever heard about cows chewing their cud? You ever heard that before? The cows just like standing around the field like, you guys know? Listen, I know some of you guys are from Georgia, so I know you know what cows drink. Anyway, you know what they're doing? They're regurgitating some food from their first stomach back up into their mouth to chew it some more. Not because they're gross, but because that's how they're adapted to do it. Right? So chew some, swallow, put it back up, start swallowing again. Different strategies, right? And the idea is to infer what you can about surface area, how long it takes you to digest your food, and what you're eating. Right? So meat is pretty easy to digest. So us as omnivores have a pretty short digestive tract compared to herbivores. But if you look at something like a lion, it's super short because you don't need all that time because it's easier and quicker to digest. Most of your muscle digestion or protein digestion happens in your stomach anyway. It's a really good start there. So you will see adaptations in other groups to their particular type of diet. So it's good to know that that's a thing, right? A little bit of difference across groups, but most of what we're talking about here is human-centric. That's just the way our book is done. We could take a comparative approach and try to toss that in a little bit, but mostly we're talking in relation to humans and then sort of jumping out and saying, well, this is how other animals do it. Okay? So that's kind of the way this is structured. Questions about digestive system before we move to the next system in line? You guys fascinated so far? It's your body, man. It's how you're working. Okay, nervous system. Let's see. There's not a ton that I want to talk about with the nervous system. Ooh, there's an Easter egg coming up for bonus questions. All right. So we have a complex nervous system. Vertebrates have a central nervous system, which consists of brain and spinal cord, and then peripheral nerves, which is everything else. Okay, everything that isn't brain or spinal cord is considered a peripheral nerve or part of the peripheral nervous system. So that's this last part of this summary of the figure. This all comes straight out of your textbook here. So this is just comparison of complexity of nervous systems across different groups. So in something like a cnidarian, you've got a nerve net. So there are nerve cells, but they're not really bundled into nerves. They're not really centralized. There's no brain, right? It's just sensory neurons communicating throughout the organism. In echinoderms, you start to see nerves. So nerves are actually bundles of neurons. Remember we said neurons are the functional cells in nervous tissue. They're the ones that are actually contributing to moving the messages around. Start bundling those together, that's how you get nerves. Okay, so if you talk about like your sciatic nerve or something like that, that's a whole huge bundle of a bunch of neurons. The axons of the neurons bundled together. So you start to see that in echinoderms. In animals exhibiting bilateral symmetry, you start to see brain, kind of, neurons cluster into an anterior brain. In addition to a brain, arthropods have peripheral ganglia, which are collections of nerve cells also, that are located along the ventral nerve cord. Remember, we have a dorsal nerve cord that runs down the backside. Arthropods have a ventral nerve cord. So you can see that here in the B. And they've got these little ganglia, just little concentrations of cell bodies of neurons that run down that nerve cord that is there ventrally. And it's kind of coinciding with the segments of the body too. So that's just something that you see in arthropods. Mollusks such as squid and octopi, it's actually octopuses if you look at the Greek. So I don't know why that is a pet peeve of mine, but it is. But you can say octopi, either one is acceptable. I'm just weird. They have to hunt to survive. They have complex brains containing millions of neurons. So we think that it's convergent evolution, especially with regards to the eye, because the eyes are very complex neurologically as well in things like octopuses. But the point here, the overarching theme is increasing complexity, right, throughout evolutionary history. And then you finally land on vertebrates that have both CNS, or central nervous system, brain and spinal cord, and PNS, or peripheral nerves. Okay, so those are just some differences. I'm not gonna, ask you to tell me about the nervous system of a starfish necessarily, but I just want you to know that there are different levels of complexity in animal nervous systems, and that's about it for that. The rest of this stuff here on nervous system is review. Okay, we talked about nervous tissue at least twice already in previous chapters, and the stuff that I told you then is the same stuff that I want you to know now. Neurons are the functional cells. Neuroglia or glial cells are the support cells. Okay, these cells use electrochemical signals to communicate information, sensory input, integration, and motor output. We talked about that Monday. Sensory input is coming into the receptors. And we talked about receptors and effectors, and I didn't call it an integrator, I called it control center or something like that. But these are the same three steps, right? Input, deciding what to do with that information, and then output. Okay, so that's the job of the nervous system. So you have sensory nerves in your peripheral system that are taking in information, external and internal stimulus, and they're passing it to the brain and spinal cord, which is the processing, the central nervous system. And then you have motor neurons in your peripheral nervous system again, where information is going back out to respond to the stimuli that came in. So you just take in information, figure out what to do with it, send the message out. And that's the whole job of the nervous system. I will ask you to know what is in central and what is in peripheral. Okay, if brain and spinal cord is central, everything else is peripheral. Okay, so that's pretty straightforward. We looked at the structure of the neuron before, but I don't think we sort of took our time and looked at the actual functions. I just sort of ran through it quickly. So we'll take a look at it here because these are bold terms, which means you should know them. Okay. So the structure of a typical neuron, there is variability, but the typical sort of structure, most of your neurons look like this. You have a cell body, and you can tell it's the cell body by the fact that the nucleus is there. Okay. This is where integration is happening on the level of the neuron. So information is coming into the cell through the dendrites. Okay, so these are dendrites. Dendro means branches or tree. Okay, so when you look at it, it sort of looks like tree branches. Those are your dendrites. That's where information is coming in. Where is it coming from? In our picture, you can see another neuron sort of faded out, but it's hinting that it's there. So this is an axon of another neuron. Okay, so they act in chains, right, to get the information to where it needs to be. So information comes into the dendrites. That information is processed in your cell body by figuring out, is this signal strong enough for me to need to pass it along or not? Okay, so that's the level of sort of integration that's going on here through a series of electrical interpretations, if you will. And if it's decided that this is an important signal and it needs to go forward, it'll go down the axon. So axon carries nerve signals away, and then you've got axon terminals at the other end that are connecting with dendrites of another neuron, or a target tissue, like a muscle cell or endocrine cell or something like that. So that's, I want you guys to know the functions of those parts. Dendrites, cell body or soma, that's another name for the cell body, and the axon. Good? Guys, okay? Nervous system is not as interesting as digestive system, is it? Plus, we talked about this already, so it's old news. All right, I'm going to give you this. I really like to talk about action potential, but we don't have time. So this is your Easter egg for this chapter. Watch this. video on the action potential. It's all about how nerve signals are propagated. It's pretty interesting if you're into this kind of thing. So, I mean, I could lecture on it, but it would take like the whole class. So just watch this, get a little overview, and maybe see some bonus questions on the action potential. All right. Cool, moving on, endocrine. Endocrine is pretty interesting, I think. What does the endocrine system consist of? We talked about it a little bit in terms of being made of epithelial tissue. A lot of the structures are made of epithelial tissue. They are your glands. Glands secrete hormones. The endocrine system is all of your glands and organs that have endocrine function. So it doesn't have to necessarily just be a gland. It can be an organ that does something else, but also secretes hormones. So you get examples of both of those. Remember that your endocrine system works very tightly with your nervous system to maintain homeostasis. So hormones are those chemical messengers. So your nervous system releases signals that say to these glands, release. Okay, and they release their hormones, and the hormones travel to the target tissues and affect the response. Or your nervous system says, stop releasing, and it stops, and then the target tissues get no more stimulus to do something, and then it halts, right? So it's all about that negative feedback. So maintaining homeostasis requires nervous and endocrine cooperation. Okay, this is the part where I was saying there are organs with endocrine function. It doesn't matter if it's an organ or a gland, as long as it's secreting a hormone, it can be considered endocrine structure. So I don't have it on here, but a really good example of that would be your pancreas. So we just talked about pancreas in the digestive system, right? It's an accessory digestive organ because it secretes enzymes and it secretes bicarbonate ions as part of digestion, but insulin and glucagon are hormones that control blood sugar. So because it's doing both jobs, it's an organ of the digestive system, but it's also an endocrine organ. So that's what I mean by sometimes you have organs with endocrine function, okay? Hormones are messengers, we talked about that. Let's see. Oh, what do I want to tell you? We've been talking about target tissues. When I use that term, are you guys comfortable with what I'm talking about? What do I mean when I say a target tissue? Should I assume that you're not comfortable with me using that term? So hormone, let me put it in terms of hormones. So hormones have a particular type of cell that they will activate or inactivate, and that's the target tissue. So in your endocrine system, the glands that secrete hormones are largely just loosing those hormones into your bloodstream. Okay, but those hormones don't work on every single type of cell that they encounter as they circulate through your bloodstream. They're only going to work on a very specific type of cell or tissue. That's the target tissue. So your endocrine glands and your endocrine organs can just release chemical messengers broadly and trust that they'll only act when they reach the tissue that they're intended to affect. Okay, that's what I mean by target tissue. Okay, so they're very specialized to these particular target tissues, and the target tissues know, they recognize the hormone and they know what to do because they have receptors on their surfaces that bind to those hormones and something happens. Okay, so they have to have those receptors that are sensitive to those hormones in order for them to do anything. So hormones do all kinds of things like regulate development, right? Regulate growth, energy metabolism, reproduction, and behavior. So that's like pretty much everything, right? Hormones that regulate development. What do you think that means? Like, can you think of an example of developmental changes that are regulated by hormones? Growth is a good one, yeah. Growth and development. So you have a hormone called growth hormone. That's what it does. It stimulates cell division, among other things. What about puberty? That's development that's hormonally regulated. What about reproduction? Same hormones, right? Estrogens, testosterones, anything along those lines. Energy metabolism, we're talking about insulin and glucagon, how you use sugar that's been taken into your system. What about behavior? Can you give any examples?
Serotonin.
Yeah, sure. Serotonin, mood, right? What about epinephrine? Epinephrine is considered a hormone. What kind of behavior does that invoke if you get a surge of epinephrine? Fight or flight, yep. It's the same thing as adrenaline. Essentially, it's just two different names for the same thing because it comes from your adrenal glands, which are hormone glands that release epinephrine. So epinephrine is adrenaline. It's the panic hormone. So yeah, all kinds of things are regulated by these chemical messages. They are upregulated and downregulated. This is a pretty cool function that your cells can do. So cells increase or decrease the number of receptors in response to the presence of the hormone. So if you get a whole bunch of a particular hormone in your system and your target tissues realize there's a whole bunch of hormone here, I must need a lot of it, they can start making more receptors so that they can pull more of it into the cells. Upregulation. They can also respond by saying, whoa, there's too much of this hormone here. I don't need that much. I'm too sensitive. I'm going to downregulate my sensitivity by stopping to make some of those receptors. So cells can actually dictate their response to hormones as a response to the concentration of the hormone that's there. It's a really intricate, delicate balance between control, right? So that's pretty cool. I won't ask you anything about mechanisms of upregulation and downregulation just because we're not going to go into it in a whole lot of detail, but it's just kind of cool to know that your cells can do all that stuff. Okay, your pituitary gland, somebody mentioned that as an example of a gland. We were talking about glands on Monday. This one we call your master gland because it has a close interconnectedness with your hypothalamus in your brain. So your pituitary actually hangs off of a little tiny piece of tissue called the infundibulum. You guys don't have to know that. Right off of this part of your brain. And all of your controlling hormones come from there. Most of your controlling hormones come from there. So your pituitary gland is shooting out growth hormone for one thing, but it's also shooting out hormones that tell other endocrine glands to turn out their hormones. So it's the master gland. So that's important to know. And the hypothalamus is the link between the nervous and the endocrine system because the nervous system receives the stimulus. The hypothalamus then tells the pituitary gland to release the hormones to stimulate and inhibit other glands to release their hormones. So this is an incredibly intricate system that dictates your development, growth, metabolism, reproductive behavior, etc. Right? So endocrine is like in charge of that. It's also integration, right? So nervous system integrates tissue by pushing electrochemical signals, neurotransmitters, and electrical charge signals around, right? So information flows that way, but these are chemical messages, right? Hormones. So the information is flowing that way too. So it's just another part of the integration of your body systems as a whole. So endocrine has its function, information, right? But it has a function in all the other body systems as well, because it's affecting different target tissues. Oh, good, a whole list of hormones. It's not the whole list, not even close, but there are a few selected ones here, and I want you guys to know what they are, right? So we can run through it. Well, we have so much time to get through the rest of these systems. Hold on a second. I think we'll go through these together. I can chill out a little because we still have Monday. We've got musculoskeletal, respiratory, circulatory, excretory, immune, and reproductive. Okay. Yeah, we got 20 minutes left today. Let's do the hormones together, so you're not totally on your own. All right, most of these we have either mentioned already or you've probably heard of. That's why I chose these, because they're not obscure. You might have already heard about them. You may already know what they do. I can imagine a matching section on an exam, something like this, okay? So insulin and glucagon we've talked about, they both control blood sugar. Insulin lowers your blood sugar by pushing it into your cells. You guys hear me? It lowers blood sugar. Glucagon raises blood sugar by releasing stored glycogen from your liver and your muscles when your body needs more sugar. So insulin and glucagon allow you to go for longer without eating. So you can sort of regulate your energy metabolism without having to constantly graze. Okay, so you can store and release, and you can push it and shuttle sugar into your cells when you get a lot of it at one time. These both control blood sugar, and they're both secreted by the pancreas. So I will probably ask you to know function and gland that they're associated with. Okay, gland or organ in case of the pancreas. You guys can handle it? I know you can handle it. Okay. Epinephrine and norepinephrine we just talked about, stress response or fight or flight. they're cooperative with one another, so they do pretty much the same thing. There's some slight differences, but don't worry about that. Both of them are secreted by the adrenal glands. The adrenal glands are called adrenal because they sit on top of your kidneys. Anybody know the term for kidneys? Well, it's nephro, right? But that's really like the internal pieces, the nephrons and stuff. But the kidney itself, think about the artery feeding the kidney. Do you remember that? Are you in AP2 now? No. Okay. The term for kidney-related stuff is renal. Ring the bell? Yeah. So adrenal is on top of kidney. Okay, that's why they're called adrenal glands. So you have one on each side, and they secrete epinephrine and norepinephrine to regulate your stress response. All right, you've got thyroid hormones. Can you guess which gland secretes your thyroid hormones? It's called your thyroid gland, right? So that one's pretty straightforward. These help to regulate metabolic rates, among lots of other things. Growth hormone stimulates cellular activities that promote growth. Things like cell division, things like repair. So growth hormone regulates a lot of different things, all related to growth and putting on tissue, so production of tissue. That's secreted by the pituitary gland, which is that master gland, right, that's controlling everybody else, but it's also secreting growth hormone. Parathyroid hormone comes from the parathyroid gland. Okay, so that's pretty straightforward. Parathyroid hormone raises blood calcium. There is a different hormone that lowers blood calcium. That's called calcitonin, and calcitonin comes from the thyroid gland. So there's a really interesting interplay between thyroid and parathyroid. So here's your thyroid. It's this butterfly-shaped gland in the neck. Can you guess where your parathyroid glands are, based on the name? Around it, yeah, para, the side, right? So there's actually usually like 4, 1, 2, 3, 4, 2 on each lobe of your thyroid. And they work together. So when your blood calcium is low, parathyroid hormone is released from the parathyroid gland to increase your blood calcium. Remember I said you need calcium for like everything. Muscle contraction, heart rate control. I mean, the list goes on and on. If you have to have a good balance of calcium. It's one of those really tightly regulated homeostatic values. When you need more calcium, where do you think you get it? Where do you store calcium? Bones, yeah. So parathyroid hormone actually stimulates breakdown of bone tissue to get some calcium out into circulation. But when your calcium is too high, calcitonin reverses that. And it starts having you uptake calcium again. But calcitonin comes from the thyroid, not the parathyroid. So only the parathyroid is involved with raising blood calcium. It's the job of the thyroid to bring it back down again. So that's a pretty interesting relationship there. Melatonin, have you guys ever heard of melatonin? You can buy that and take it over the counter, right? If you have trouble with what? Sleeping. Melatonin is involved with maintaining your circadian rhythms. When is it day? When is it night? When should you sleep? When should you wake? Those are your circadian rhythms. That comes from a gland called the pineal gland. It's very frequently confused with pituitary, just because they both start with PI, I think. It's also in your brain too, so they're both up there. Pituitary over here by the hypothalamus, pineal over here behind hypothalamus. The pineal gland makes melatonin, keeps you regulated as far as circadian rhythm. And then your steroid sex hormones come from your gonads. So you've got androgens, including testosterone. So those are typically associated with male secondary sexual characteristics, and those come from your testes. And then you've got estradiol and progesterone that come from ovaries, so are more associated with female secondary sex characteristics. But both genders have some of both. It just has to do with how much of each one that we have, which dictates development, right? Which is one of the jobs of hormones. So you guys cool with this list? Can you memorize? I mean, it's just straight memorization. It's not too complex, but it's a lot of terms. So you'll see it on the exam. A few questions about hormones. Good? Okay. All right. Who loves human body systems? It's interesting. All right. Let's see. I think we'll stop. But early again. You guys are gonna give me bad reviews because I don't make you stay till 12:15. Okay, I think we're good. I know that this is a lot coming at you quickly, so I think we're good to stop at noon. We have like four more systems to cover. I don't do much with reproductive because you guys already know that stuff mostly, and if you don't, it's really not my job to tell you, right? So we're not gonna go into depth about that too much. We will talk about musculoskeletal system because it's kind of interesting. We'll talk a little bit about bones and bone development. Muscular system, we've already covered this, right? The different types of muscle tissues, that's all reviewed. I took this out because I love talking about how muscle cells contract, but it's not for everyone, so we're not going to do that. Respiratory system, we'll talk a little bit about that. That's pretty interesting. Circulatory is tightly connected to respiratory, so that won't take us too long. We'll talk about heart and circulatory system. Excretory, that's really straightforward and easy. Immune will lead us right into our discussion next Wednesday. So we'll do all this on Monday. We'll talk mostly about immune towards the end, and then I'll give you guys a couple videos again, some more Easter eggs, 3 of them, and then 1 slide on reproductive. So I think we're going to do that Monday. Oh wait, I forgot I added those. That's okay. We'll be talking more about reproduction in other animals than in us. I got very carried away with internal and external fertilization last time, I guess. Anyway, we'll cover all that on Monday.